At the time of this recording, the 2024 elections are just around the corner. And while this podcast is by no means a political podcast, there's no way to get away from politics completely. After all, the overall idea with politics is to collectively decide how we want to improve our communities. But beyond the issues themselves, the way we treat each other during and after these elections has a lasting impact on our community. In this episode, I'm joined by Ron Mock from the Civility Project to talk about the importance of civility in local elections and how we can improve the political culture in our communities. We cover a wide range of topics, including the local candidate forums that happened in Newberg and Dundee, how to treat each other with respect, especially our opponents, why local elections matter more than most people realize, and how disagreements can actually be a gift when approached with the right mindset. We also touch on the importance of staying informed, voting in local elections, and we discuss the pros and cons of the new ranked choice voting system that is being proposed. But whatever your political beliefs are, what matters most is the way we treat each other when we disagree. Hi, I'm Daniel Roberts, host of the Giving Town podcast, where we share stories about the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. This podcast is brought to you by my real estate team, the Joyful Roberts Group, where we help your family make the right move. And as of recently, all of the agents on our team are actually seniors real estate specialists. So we specialize in helping seniors move. But no matter who you are, we'd be happy to help you with buying or selling a home anywhere around the Newberg area. And if you're interested, you can learn more about us at thejoyfulrobertsgroup.com. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ron Mock. Ron, thanks for joining me again on the Giving Town podcast. It's great to have you back.
Thank you.
I think it's been about 2 years. You were one of the first episode I'd done under the new name of the Giving Town podcast. We discussed the Civility Project back then, and now we've got some other things to discuss.
Okay.
So we recently just had the candidate forums for Newberg and Dundee, talking about some local elections and issues, things like that. And we'll get into some of those things. I know on this podcast, I typically like to say, to stay, fairly apolitical. It's not by any means a political podcast, but there's some important things to discuss. And so the first thing is, what's the importance of having these candidate forums, and who puts it on, and why is this such an important thing to do for our community?
Well, the candidate forums are an attempt to give people a chance to see the candidates in person, see a little bit of how they interact with each other and how they interact with the audience and how they respond to the questions being asked. So to fill in kind of in person the kind of information that you can't really get by just reading a voter's pamphlet or looking at signs. Signs don't tell you much of anything about the candidate except their name. And the voter's pamphlet is what the candidate has chosen to tell you. That's important. But in a candidates forum where they get questions they may not have seen in advance and things like that, you get a chance to see how they think on their feet and get a sense of their personality and so forth like that. So I think it helps fill out the information people get.
Which, by the way, for Newberg, the forums were recorded. So we should have those and should be able to link them in the...
So, yeah, the Newberg City Council forum was recorded, and we had all the city council candidates there, so it's a good one to listen to. We also had candidates for state representative from Newberg and state senator. Only one of the state senator candidates could make it, and so you just see Anna Sharp there, but in the others you see all three of the candidates running for the state House of Representatives from the Newberg area. And so, yeah, you can see those as well. And those have all been recorded. We'll have a link, I suppose, in your notes as how to connect to that recording.
So back to why this is an important thing. You mentioned, obviously, you get to see a different side of the candidates from the pamphlet or from a sign. What kind of questions, though, are you asking? It's not just about issues, right?
So one of our goals in putting together these forums, and when I say I should say which groups were involved. I work for the George Fox University Civility Project, and so we're one of the co-sponsors, and the Newberg forums were held on the George Fox campus. The other groups that are involved are the Salem Valley Chamber of Commerce, the Newberg City Club, and a relatively new group in the Newberg and Dundee area called Newberg and Dundee United as Neighbors. And so these four groups came together to put the forums on. I think what would be common to all of our motives was this information part I talked about, but also, particularly for the City Club, I know, and for United as Neighbors and the Civility Project, it's to try to help give candidates a chance to practice communicating in ways that don't demean each other, that aren't going to drive political polarization and alienation in our community, and so we can all experience what it's like to have a constructive civil conversation. So that was one of our main motives for the United as Neighbors and Civility Project to get involved with this. Also, I'd been a participant in some candidate forums when I was on school board that were not really well organized and not even fair necessarily to the candidates because some didn't get noticed in time and things like that. So we've been really careful to try to make everything as fair as possible to all the candidates because that was not a good experience and not helpful. So that's part of it. But from the Civility Project point of view, the main motive for doing this is to give people a chance to practice communicating and watching people communicate in ways that are constructive. So we remind them of the civility pledge that the United as Neighbors put together for the 22 election, which we're still promoting. People promise various things that help them be better communicators in politics without driving alienation and polarization.
It's one of the interesting things about politics in general is it happens on a local level and more broadly, but every 2 years, and then obviously every 4 years there's a presidential election. And it can feel I guess actually city council's even on, that's every 3 years, right?
Well, actually we have something every year because in the odd years we have the school board and park district elections. Right. In even years we have the city council and the legislative elections and the commissioner elections at the county level. So every year we're having some kind of election.
So every year there's some kind of election, but during the year that there's elections, people running, they're not going to have another opportunity for at least a couple of years before getting to potentially run again for that same position. And it's interesting because a lot of tactics, especially, we're kind of seeing this in the national scene right now, where there's definitely a lack of civility there in terms of how opponents are talking about each other, mm-hmm. treating each other, and mudslinging, things like that. And we've seen some of that in various local elections here. And that to me is kind of like what I like to see and I think that's kind of what the Civility Project is working for. Like how can we avoid that, and have peaceful elections? How can we, not be sore losers effectively, play fair, be kind to each other? But it also reminds me a bit of the prisoner's dilemma. Where like, are you familiar with the prisoner's dilemma? Sure. For those who may not know, it's basically, the prisoner's dilemma is kind of this ethical or philosophical idea that if there's two people that are prisoners, and correct me if I'm wrong, where basically, they have the opportunity to either, how is it? They each, you probably know better than I do.
So that's set up so that each prisoner has the opportunity to try to blame everything on the other prisoner, or not. And if they both don't blame the other person, then they get convicted for a smaller crime and they don't have to have as long of a sentence.
Right.
But if they succeed in blaming the other person gets a long sentence and they get off free. And so should the prisoner complain? If they both complain, then they're both going to get a longer sentence. So it's, but do you want to, from the prisoner's point of view, sort of cheat and try to just blame the other and hope that they don't blame you? So the way the payoffs work, one person can gain at the other's expense at the risk of both of them getting worse.
Right. And so if both play both play kindly and don't blame each other, essentially, and in this case in politics, if both sides agree, hey, let's be kind, let's not do any mudslinging, let's be truthful, let's be civil, all those kinds of things, it's going to be a much better turnout in the long run. Whereas, hypothetically.
It's not clear that that's the case. It's they've done a lot of research on that. And negative campaigning does generally reduce turnout, but controversy also gathers attention, and you get attention for people to turn out. So it's a mixed bag somewhat. Okay.
Well, that's interesting. This is something that you're probably much more familiar with.
So what the candidates want is for their people to turn out. So one way to do that is to be attractive with your personality and proposals, but the other way is to make them afraid of the other candidate. And if you want to use all the channels to get your own turnout, making the other candidate into somebody really bad and scary helps your turnout. And if it has any effect on lowering turnout, it's on the undecided people and on the people that might be moderate, not very enthusiastic supporters of the person you're targeting. So if I want to beat you in an election and I make up a story about how you eat, I shouldn't have said eating anything, that you, I don't know. I can't think of anything bad. That's something really bad.
I commit fraud, that I'm doing all the kind of things.
You're a fraudster, or something. Sure. You've been taking advantage of old people. And I say all that. It might get some of my people that weren't thinking about voting, hey, we got to go quick and go vote for sure so that Roberts doesn't get it. And, but it also might depress some of your voting. So it's a mixed bag. Yeah. Now, the problem is if we're both hammering on each other, then people start to have a real negative view.
Then you get people who just kind of lose all hope in all politics in general.
Yes.
And that's kind of, I think what I'm getting at is like the prisoner's dilemma. If both sides said, hey, even though it could get better turnout, we're not going to say anything negative about the other side. If both people did that, maybe you'd get overall lower turnout, but, we wouldn't have a lot of the vitriol and fear-mongering and all those kind of things. But then if you only have one side doing it, then it's going to be a landslide election because, just because someone's playing by ethical rules. So how do we deal with this, right?
Two things we can do that I want to say about that. First, there's reasons why you might want people to raise negative things about people. You want, if there's something true about another person that has a bearing on whether they'll be a good public servant, the public has a right to know that. Mm-hmm. And so it should be shared. Making up stuff about the other person, no, you're poisoning them then, because then you're giving people false information. You're basically defrauding them. Okay. So if you make up something, you might get the turnout you want and suppress the other turnout and all that stuff, but you are now committing a fraud on the public.
Right.
And that's bad. So you would want to be careful about what you'd say, and you'd want to say it if you had some negative on the other opponent. You'd want to say it kind of conservatively, kind of carefully, so that you're not risking doing a fraud on the public. This is assuming if you want good democracy and then you're just not trying to just win, right?
Yeah.
So we don't want to say no negative necessarily. I don't think that's ideal. If it's too nicey, then lots of things don't get. So the voters in New York City right now are dealing with a mayor who turns out to have a lot of corrupt friends and may himself be very corrupt, even though he seemed like a very attractive candidate and he won his election 3 years ago.
Okay.
But if they had known more about his friends and maybe more about himself, we're not sure his own situation, then maybe they would make a different decision. And they should have the right to have that information to make the decision. So you don't want to suppress bad information necessarily.
That's a good point. So even within the bounds of civility, so say you're bringing up negative things about a person, how do you do that in a civil way? And I know you mentioned be careful, but I mean, we're also dealing with on a local level, both sides, maybe feel like their opponent has some negative qualities. Maybe that's why they ran in the first place, because they said, well, I think I disagree with this person on whatever issue and feel like, I need to run. So what's a way to do that in a civil way? Like you're saying, you can't just not say it, but also there's hearsay and rumors and
yes, so it's hard to know. And so there's a lot of judgment there, and you could imagine candidates who are not trying to do harm to the public, who want to win upright, still making mistakes about how to do that. But if you're a candidate who's looking for photos of the other person, like they're picking their nose or something that's kind of gross, and you publish that photo, that's not paying attention to the need for civility in the situation. Why you've picked the worst possible photo? If I would like to see candidates who find nice neutral photos for each other if they're going to use the other person, then be very careful about what they say. You can ask questions. I've heard this. What do you say? I mean, give them a chance to deal with it if you were in a setting like that. But don't get way out ahead of the facts, and don't take parts of the facts. I think there have been candidacies and campaigns where people raise facts that by themselves are true, but they leave out the intervening facts that changes the picture. If you're doing that, that's not civility.
I hadn't really thought about this until just now as a topic to discuss, but social media is more and more becoming even a primary platform for politics. Yeah. And the challenge, the great thing about a candidate forum is you've got people there, it's in person, and people treat each other much better in person than they do online. And we've all heard about, maybe not all of us, but I think most people have heard about social media being like an echo chamber, because the algorithm says, well, this is the kind of content you like to see. It's either going to make you angry or, whatever, to feed into what you're going to pay attention to. Yeah. So I think it's something that, can you address that? Just like how to be careful as we are going about our lives, consuming information, how to be careful to really question ourselves and say, okay, maybe there's another side of the story here.
So now we're thinking about it from the voter's perspective mostly. And this is really important, because if we're going to have improvement in how we have our conversations, the voters are going to be the key. And the candidates have every incentive to try to appeal to the voters in ways that the voters, that will influence the voters. And so, I think that one of the reasons we've been focusing so much on local politics with the Civility Project of George Fox, partly because, it's hard for George Fox to have it's a small college. It's not going to have a national impact easily. But one of the positive reasons for it is if it's possible to help improve the political culture, is what we'll call it. I'll explain that in a minute. Improve the political culture, it's going to be easiest or most likely happen at a local level, at a community level. What I mean by political culture is how we go about discussing things when we disagree. So I know some people, I know you want your podcast to avoid politics, but in a way you can't, because every time people are making a decision, they're doing politics. We have politics in our families, we have politics in our churches, we have politics in our businesses, and we have politics in our communities and our nation. So anytime we're making decisions together as a group, we're doing politics. And so how is it that we go about doing that? What's our practices? What things do we value? What things do we let people get away with? And what things do we not let them get away with? From my point of view, trying to improve our political culture so that we take advantages of our disagreements, and rather than make them a cause of disruption, is if we hold our candidates and their supporters for the candidates that we favor, we hold them responsible for the tenor of their communications. So that's one thing, and I'm going to talk about a couple others, but then I'm going to say a little bit more about this. If there is a situation, it's a little hard for individuals to do this, but if there's a situation where somebody with some resources for a candidate, money particularly, would say to a candidate, we're ready to support you, we like your politics, your political positions, but if you start destroying our political culture by dealing with misinformation or, saying untrue things about the other candidates or whatever, we're going to take our money back. And you'll just have to live without us. And if voters would write to their candidates and say, I'm ready to support you, but what you did over here on the other day when you said this about that person, that wasn't fair. You got to cut it out or I'm not voting for you. I'll take your sign down, whatever. Okay. And it's going to have to happen like that. And it's only going to happen like that if we, in the local experience of our local political conversations, experience what it's like to do well. Yeah. And that's why I'm in the Civility Project. I've spent most of my time focusing on local communities and trying to help find ways for them to experience good political conversation rather than destructive.
What are some things that you've seen, and we'll get to the candidate forums here in a bit, but within the Civility Project, it's been a few years now that you've been
it's coming up on 4 years.
4 years.
At the 1st of November, it'll be officially 4 years.
Do you feel like you've gained traction over the past 4 years in helping shift our political culture?
I do, but I have to warn you, this is what a civil candidate should do too. I have to warn you that I am not in the best perspective to know that, because I'm seeing things that are successes, and I might be missing some of the things where things are getting worse. One of the things that we've done locally, I helped get a group started here in Newberg and Dundee called United as Neighbors. And they have helped support the candidates forums, and they've done some other things. One of the projects they've done, we didn't pull it off this election, but we did in the last 2 times, was to have get-togethers for the candidates before the forum.
Okay.
So the best example of this, I think, was a year ago last spring with the school board election in Newberg. There were 5 seats open and 2 candidates for each seat, and they were basically in kind of unofficial 2 slates. So the one group was people who agreed with each other. They were mostly they were the incumbents, basically, and the challengers were people who basically kind of agreed with each other, and so they kind of ran as slates. And that had the potential to further divide our community, which has already had problems that way. So one of our volunteers, it wasn't my idea, but one of our volunteers suggested, hey, why don't we get these guys together and just see if they could have a chat? So we did that. We had, I think, 8 of the 10 candidates. The 2 that didn't make it, I think, were out of town. So they couldn't get there, but we got most of the candidates there. And it was at a private home. And it was off record. They weren't allowed to talk anything about school board politics because they had a quorum of the school board there, so they couldn't talk anything about school board per se. So they just got to know each other. They talked about what they were interested in and stuff. I wasn't at the meeting because I used to be on the school board, and they, might have twisted the conversation somehow. But the people were there, and the people I talked to from the candidates said it was really good because they had a chance to get to know each other. That kind of thing where even at the candidate level, we help them establish connections that aren't about politics, where they get to know each other's people. That's I think a real promising approach, because if you've gotten to know somebody and you kind of like them, you're less likely to just discount whatever effect you're having on them by saying something untrue about them. And be more careful with that kind of conversation. So there are different things like that we can do. I think you and as a citizen, or me as a citizen, you mentioned that we tend to get into our echo chambers, and the social media encourages that. They feed on it. They make money on making you angry and afraid, so forth, so that you'll keep coming back to their information. Got to break out of that. We got to find ways to make connections with people that cross our political differences. So we have ways to remember that they're human beings and they're not evil people, and they just have different ideas than us. That's kind of a starting place.
Yeah. There's I think it was a website that brought up on major political, I think it only did it for like major political issues, but it would bring up like both sides. Like, here's what the conservative says about it. Here's what the liberal perspective is on it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do know what you're talking about. I have their cup on my desk. Can I come up with their name? That's a good question.
I'm going to type it in real quick. And
but there's more than one. I've discovered another one. And are you going to have notes on your website where we can put links to those things?
Yeah, I'll have links.
Okay, I can get you those 2 links.
Okay. Well, I'll put the links to that. What was it? See if I can find it. We'll have to go and get that. But there are, if you look up, whenever you're looking at a topic, it's tempting to just go with your party if you're a part of a party. But looking at what is the other, so for me, I did this specifically on the topic of abortion. Now, personally, I don't like the idea of abortion. That's just my take. But when I actually looked into, okay, what do people say, why should abortion not be illegal, for example, and looked at some of the arguments on that side, it opened my eyes, and I said, okay, maybe I don't fully agree, but I had a lot more empathy towards people who supported the idea, which is, I think, very helpful, because if you don't have that, then you just say, well, people are either, immoral, or they're stupid, or all these negative things, because why would anyone in their right mind vote that way? It just doesn't make sense. And that's kind of a way to entrench yourself and say, well, I'm not even going to look into that topic, because, anyone with half a brain who knows that that's nonsense type of thing. And I feel like that I've had a few of those different experiences where something I had a very strong belief in, allowed myself to really explore the other side and said, okay, rational, intelligent people make the opposite decision that I would. Why? And it's just an interesting experience to go through. It's hard, honestly, because when you embrace the idea of nuance rather than just I'm 100% right and the other side's 0% right, 100% wrong, when it's really like, okay, maybe I'm 63% right and the other side's, whatever that 37%, it's like I'm not 100% right and never will be, but I can only vote in a binary way where it's either yes or no on any of these issues. And it's kind of challenging. And I think most people don't want to do that because it's kind of hard emotionally to feel like I'm not 100% right. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? So
I just before I came here to do this, I came from an appointment with my physical therapist because I hurt myself in a sports injury at the end of the summer. Wiffle ball. So terrible thing. But I tripped and fell and I strained some things in my leg and it's been bothering me. And my physical therapist keeps telling me what you need to do is these exercises. He gave me a list of exercises. You need to push and work, do it regularly. I'm not really good at that kind of discipline. I'm not that kind of disciplined guy when it comes to physical activity. So it's probably taken me longer to recover than it should have. And I've mostly recovered now, and so that's good. But I would have done it better and faster had I worked at it. And I think, just sitting on my duff is easier than getting up and doing a bunch of awkward exercises that hurt for a while, It would have been easier for you not to go explore other people's views on abortion or any other issue and just stay with what you knew. It's comfortable. It's that you're not pushing yourself out into something uncomfortable. But I think in our moral life, in our personal intellectual life, in our political life for sure, we need to practice the harder work. The disagreements we have, in my personal view, are by design. And you can do this either by thinking about it as being creation, which is one of the ways I'm comfortable with thinking of it that way, or by thinking about it as product of evolution, whichever. But the human race has survived and is equipped to survive so well because we're so adaptable, and the adaptability comes from our disagreements. We are born so we're not identical. We have different genetic information. If you have an identical twin, I don't think you're an identical twin, are you?
Am I?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not.
Okay. Then, unless you're an identical twin, then you have the same genetic information. But as soon as you're born, you start having different experiences.
Some people think my dad and I are twins, but
I can tell you apart.
Aside.
So, but the idea here is that those differences that we come equipped with by our very birth and by the inherent nature of our different experiences give us different perspectives. And this is not a weakness. This is a strength. Every human advance has come through disagreements, from democracy, development of democracy, or the development of your cell phone. In either case, those are built by disagreements, and good manufacturers of cell phones go out and look for disagreements, look to see what their customers don't like or what somebody else is doing different, and look for good ideas. So if in your political or other views, you are isolating yourself with people who agree with you, you're probably having fun. When you have a conversation, they say, yes, and they add another argument, and you go, yeah, right, and that's kind of fun. But that's just burrowing yourself down into a hole. You've now isolated yourself from other information. A better kind of information would be you had somebody say something and then you say back, maybe, but, or they respond to you, maybe, but, and now we're having a conversation where things are different. That's a chance to learn. And we need to be able to learn. Nobody, like you said, is 100% right. And in fact, it's probable that where we disagree, that you're 40% right, and I'm 30% right, and everybody's 30% wrong. There's something we haven't figured out yet about that. I think that might apply to abortion too, but that's a long story. Probably not enough time for that in this one. So I would rather actually see, even better than a maybe but conversation is this what you mean conversation? That where each of us is asking, is this what you mean? And then I gave my attempt to explain your point of view to your satisfaction, so that if worse came to worse and you weren't there and I was in another conversation, they asked me, hey, what does Daniel think about this? I said, well, I talked to him about this. We don't agree, but here's what he says. And you would be able to trust me to give your point of view to that third person, because I heard it so well and I reflected it back to you so well. That would be the real conversation where we take advantage of our disagreements. And probably everybody learns something that nobody knew before.
That also sounds like good marriage advice or relationship advice in general. Asking first, is that what you mean, versus, do you try that in?
Sometimes. So I've been going around using the phrase disagreement as a gift for the last couple of years, because I personally think it's a gift from God, that God designed us this way. And that's a loving thing about us, that we disagree. He gave it to us out of love, God did. So my wife heard me do that for a while, and about a year ago, she printed up a T-shirt for me and gave it to me for Father's Day. Maybe it was just this last Father's Day. Yeah, it was. And it says, disagreement is a gift on it. And so then about 2 months later, I'd had a conversation with one of our adult kids. I can't remember which one. We have 4. And I was a little bit exasperated by something that probably one of my sons. I have a daughter and 3 sons. It was probably a son. And I said, I just looked, why did they say, what's the matter with him? And she said, what's that shirt you're wearing say? Oh, yeah, it says disagreement is a gift. Her point was I needed to follow my own advice a little bit more in that case. So I don't do it every time. I should do it more.
It's hard, though. I mean, in that kind of situation where you have a disagreement and you have those thoughts of what's wrong with this person. And I mean, I have those thoughts too, as much as I try to be understanding and empathetic. Sometimes I feel like it's challenging when other people won't have the same level of fallibilism, to use kind of
that's the right word, yeah,
ethical term
for it.
We recently had Phil Smith on here talking about fallibilism. He was my ethics professor at George Fox.
Yeah.
And that was one of my favorite topics. And kind of what led to a lot of this is, I was very dogmatic when I was younger and had very little tolerance for people who disagreed with me. And I've come to recognize, after being humiliated a few times, being wrong, that, okay, maybe I need to be a little bit more careful with what I think is right and wrong. Mm-hmm. It's challenging. I never thought about it like exercising a muscle, like you said, but I think it is. And it's just, even though none of us are going to be perfect at that, but it seems like it's an important thing to practice, and be willing, just like we needed practice eating well and practice exercising, it's just as important to practice allowing disagreement to be seen as a gift rather than as something to be discarded.
So, but there's a payoff too. And I've done this enough, I guess, that I've experienced this payoff, probably more than I've done it physically, although I've experienced it there too. When you've done the work, when you've practiced, you've gone out there and run when you were supposed to, and you've gone out there and listened to somebody really well when you were supposed to. There's a point of satisfaction when you realize you've had a gain as well. So earlier on, you said something about civility and and trying to be nice to one another, not saying negative things. There is a criticism of civility that this comes up, that this touches on. And one of the criticisms of civility is that it is often used to just get people to be quiet. So Martin Luther King, when he was in Birmingham working to work on civil rights there, was in jail because he had been marching supposedly illegally. And the pastors in Birmingham sent him a letter basically asking him to be more civil. Kind of keep it down, you're causing trouble. And he had a long response, the famous letter from Birmingham jail. And part of that response was his argument that just to be nice, not to cause trouble, makes it if that's the rule, then it makes it very difficult for people who are being disadvantaged to be heard, or for the people who are out of power at a particular time to be heard. And so the idea that civility is just being quiet and being nice that's not what I'm working with when I think of civility. Kindness is important, but it's only the first level. When there's a clear disagreement, then the person who's being highly civil seeks out the other person to hear them, wants to understand what the situation, does not want to overlook somebody who's suffering or there's an injustice, doesn't want to miss it just because they were never brought to their attention. And then they work together with that person to try to resolve that particular, or those people trying to resolve that particular issue. That's the second level. And the third level is the one we've been talking about already, trying to tend to the political culture, to make sure that it's got room for people, that we expect that kind of thing to happen. And we've practiced it, and we've gotten out of our bubbles and have built relationships with people who disagree with us. So that's when I'm thinking about civility. It's got three levels to it, not just kindness.
Well, and I think kindness and being kind and being nice are two different things. Because being nice is trying to not cause any issues or cause problems. But I think you can be kind without being nice. I think
I've heard it the other way, so I think there's two words are
sure, maybe it's a matter of definition. You know, when I think of nice, I think of like, oh, that person's really nice. They're very, they don't cause any issues. Whereas kindness, the way I see it, has to do with what's actually the right thing.
Oh, so we are doing this. Okay. I thought I misunderstood you. That's the way I would do it.
So to be kind, sometimes you have to be not nice to be kind. No, for example, you see, and this is something I sometimes get in trouble for. If I see something going wrong that I feel like is unjust, I'm going to go and stop the person, and it's not going to be very nice. And I won't, I'm not going to just, I don't want to cause problems. Like, I'll get in the middle of something and stop a problem that I see it if I see someone who's not treating someone well. And, but I believe that's the kind thing to do is, be willing to cause problems. And I think that's kind of what, Martin Luther King was, it was like Martin Luther Jr., no, King Jr. That was kind of his point. Like the right thing is not always the nice thing. So anyway, that's kind of an aside. A few more things to discuss though. So I know I want to move along a little bit. One way or another, we're going to get to the other side of the election, and roughly half of the people who voted are going to be upset, and half the people won't. Half the people, I think, will vote, other ways and kind of don't care too much. I think that's probably a small minority. But we're going to have to learn how to be, how to not be sore losers or sore winners. How do we deal with this after November 5th?
Well, again, I want to focus my comments on the local level, but we can also say later something about the national level if you like. I'm really focusing on the local level because, as I said before, that's accessible. Mm-hmm. I can't really do much about a voter in Pennsylvania who votes the wrong way for me. But if I have a neighbor who has the sign up that I disagree with and it's been bugging me all this time, or if there's somebody who's in particular who's said things that have hurt me, the brave thing to do, the right thing to do, basically, again, for my faith, is to love the neighbor. That's hard if I don't know much about the neighbor. So it means I probably got to get to know the neighbor. This, again, is something probably where my wife is better at it than me. We had a conversation once where she said, I think we ought to love our neighbors. And I said, yeah, I'm doing that. I'm making sure our dog doesn't bark. I don't want to bother my neighbor. And she said, that's not a high level bother your neighbor. Well, sure it is, I said. I'm trying to be kind to my neighbor and thoughtful. She said, would you know if they had a crisis? No, I probably wouldn't know. They had some kind of crisis. Unless the ambulances show up at their house, I wouldn't know. She says, how can you love them if you don't know if they're in crisis? And what would you do? So her standard, which she applies probably not perfectly, but better than I do, is to try to find out about your neighbors and not pry or anything, but have conversations with them and so forth. And so one way to do that is probably in your own neighborhood, just go on talking. My neighbors will tell you I'm not the most chatty person in my neighborhood. So I need help. What I would, more productive for me is to get involved in groups where people have different opinions. United as Neighbors is such a group. And so I've really appreciated that because it's got a lot of different political views on there. But I've been sort of on the edge of, my wife is a member of the local pickleball club. That's a great thing. I have no idea what the politics are of those people. If I get to know them, that's great. Churches can often be this way. They've been performing poorly in some cases, sorting themselves by their politics, which is not good. That Friends Church kind of did that a few years ago, largely sorted themselves by politics. I've considered that to be a tragedy. But that could be a place. Other kinds of things where the main part of your relationship has nothing to do with politics and you get to know folks. Fantasy league. I'm in a fantasy baseball league. I actually don't know all the politics of people in my fantasy baseball league, even though we've been doing it for 20 years. But if those kind of relationships create some sinews, you might say, and can hold us together. Yeah. So that's one thing I think is you can do right, is just to try to think about the people you have disagreement with and find ways to get connected with them. And if they need something, love them. If you see them at Fred Meyer and they drop their groceries, go help them pick them up. I mean, just something as simple as that. So that they, as a person, don't get identified with their position and only be their position. Because they aren't.
Yeah.
They aren't their position. One more thing I want to suggest is, I've been in groups, different political groups, where most of the group has how do I put this? I've been in groups where the people have the same political views, roughly, basically speaking, both on the right and the left. And what they tend to do is get into this self-affirming conversation where they are repeating and strengthening to each other their own views, and they're not listening to the other side's views. If you find that your conversations are consistently in one political view and they're all rah-rah about that view and there's no sympathetic consideration of the other view, that's a group that's in trouble. That's a group that has got too much unanimity. And we know that decision-making groups, but it's also true of other groups, if they don't have a range of opinions on them, they tend to make errors. They tend to think themselves into boxes. They can't see all the evidence around them. And they make poor decisions.
Interesting.
You need to have a decision-making group, have a variety of people. I think that's true for your social groups as well, if you can get to it too. So I get uneasy when I'm in a group, even if I agree with them, but they are all reinforcing each other's stereotypes about other groups and making the same kind of dismissive jokes that you would never do about somebody about ethnicity or religion, but they're doing it about politics. And that's to me a sign that we're contributing to the problem rather than fixing the problem. So find ways to have more connections with other people, and don't let your groups get into sort of these rah-rah, those people are so stupid.
Yeah.
Or so evil.
I want to come back to you mentioned local little issues, and coming back specifically to the forum. So we discussed some things in, Dundee and Newberg. What were some of the issues discussed? And ideally everyone would go and watch /listen. Was it filmed too, or just recorded,
There's a video recording of the Newberg forums, both of them, but there isn't one of the Dundee one. So,
ideally, though, at least for Newberg, people would go and watch the whole forum, but I know it's long. So kind of for people that maybe don't have the time to do that, what were some of the main important issues to at least be aware of that you would say?
So most of the forum was was organized around questions that were written by a committee of people from the different groups sponsoring it. So in the Newberg case, both the state representative and the local group talked about completing the bypass was one of the issues. The Newberg Council group talked about downtown development and the development, special development district that they have, and trying to find ways to have more living wage jobs. Both the state reps and the Newberg Council talked about homelessness issues. I think that also came up in Dundee. I'm not sure I can remember more. Let's see, there were 6 questions. Those 3 were, so there was also a question about what makes you qualified to be running for this office for both of them. And they got a chance to list the issues that they particularly want to work on. Some of it went back to the same issues, some had new ones. And then we had a question about how they would get every voice in the community involved, and including the people who disagreed with them. How would they get their input on the issues in front of them, and how would they help heal divisions in the community? That question was asked in all the forums for the people. In Dundee, they also asked different list of questions. In Dundee, the issues were largely around the water situation there. They also about the city budget, which is under stress, and also about the fate of the old Dundee Elementary School and the Billick Park, which is the main park, which is actually mostly owned by the school district. And so these are issues where people are worried about changes happening and how they're going to happen around those 2 properties that are right next to each other at Dundee. So those are the kinds of issues that came up in the questions.
Why is it, before we started, I mentioned this sounds on the surface like a question with an obvious answer, but I think there is some more nuance to it. But why is it so important to be informed about local issues?
Well, so the election is the pooling of all of our understandings of what's going on, and everybody in this community has his or her own view of those issues. Even if you're not somebody that spends a lot of time thinking about politics, you know what it's like to drive on the bypass when it's not finished, or you know when there's educational issues, you have kids in the school, or maybe if you've had to look for work, somebody that had to look for work and had trouble finding a job, or it's hard to find. These are all your experiences, even if you're not politically engaged. Your experiences are part of what the system needs to know. And one of the ways we register that is by voting. It's a very rough tool, but it actually gives, if they pay attention to it, the people who win and the people who lose, gives them some pretty interesting information. They can do polling related to it too, but it gives them information about what's important to people and what their views are. It's even more powerful, of course, if you get a chance to share your perspective and your experience with somebody running for office or in office. But by paying attention to the issues that are being discussed and letting that help drive your vote, you are giving the system the information it needs, at least in some form, to make better decisions. If you don't do it, then your point of view is less likely to have an effect on one outcome. I'm not saying that you win, but it'll have a less effect, that your point of view would win or lose per se, but that it will have a less effect on the outcome. Won't have a chance to moderate a decision in your direction. So it's really important. I think also just political scientists talk about it as sort of a symbolic input. What that means is when you vote, you're tying yourself to the government. You're saying, this is my government. It's legitimate. I'm supporting it. And that would help us overcome the tendency to isolate ourselves into political ghettos, kind of speak, where we have we just talk to each other. I think you're reinforcing your commitment to the community in a way that actually will have a bearing on your own behavior.
And we recently saw the importance of voting. And I'll actually preface with, I think a lot of people become, disenfranchised is I don't know if that's the right word for this, but basically where people say, well, my vote doesn't matter. And, this has kind of been an age-old thing, people thinking, well, my vote doesn't matter with all the votes, and, what difference does it make? maybe they don't have the time they feel to dedicate to doing any research. So they say, well, my vote doesn't matter, or I don't care, whatever. But especially locally, and I think that's why you mentioned there can be so much more influence, because nationally it's easy to feel, when you're voting for a president or a senator or congressperson, it can feel like, okay, if I'm one out of, tens or hundreds of millions of votes, whatever it might be, can feel that way more. But we recently saw in our county commissioner election how important a few votes are. A few votes are. So can you talk about maybe why it is so important, and talk about kind of that situation? I think a lot of people are not even aware of what happened.
So in the county commission race, the way it's done here in Yamaha County, they have an initial election in May during the primary, and if anybody gets 50%, then they win. There were 3 candidates. None of them got 50%. I can't remember the 48 and 45 or something like that. And then the third candidate got enough to keep anybody from getting 50%. So basically in local elections, there's a lot of them that are pretty close.
I think it was less than 100 votes was the difference.
Could be, I don't know. So, but yeah, it's not uncommon for 100 votes or 200 votes to make a difference. So if you think about, there's going to be, 30,000 votes in the county. I don't know exactly. I mean, I just took that out of the air.
Sure.
It seems like, well, I'm only one of 30,000, but in many elections, you could be one of the 100 or 200 or even fewer who actually end up deciding it. If 200 of one group of voters don't show up, then that might mean the other candidate wins. So it's a little more rational in a strictly economic sense to vote in the local elections, because you are more likely to make a difference. I think it's also, even if it doesn't make a strong difference, it really helps people do the right thing, to know the proportions of. So even if something lost 2-1, if somebody lost or some ballot measure lost 2-1, it's important to know that 33% of the population didn't want this. That might help us moderate what we do and try to make it so it addresses some of those issues. If it's only 5%, why would we let the 5% decide what the 95% want? So having an accurate idea of what the balance is. And in Newberg, we went through several elections which were decided recently by 52-48. And these weren't several of them were school board elections, but it wasn't just school board. That closeness tells us something, which if we're doing a good job, we pay attention to if we're in office. If I'm one of the 52%, if I win an election with 52% of the vote, I need to remember that there were almost as many people who didn't want me. I had to figure out what it was about that. And is there some way I can address those issues as well? And if you don't vote, then you're not having any input in that information.
That's a really good point. One of the other things we talked about, which is on the ballot, I actually don't know what measure it is. I should probably look at which one that is. But it's the ranked choice voting. Can you share what that is, and some of the pros and cons, and what, if it were adopted, what that would do to elections?
So we're going to find the major argument against the ranked choice voting, because I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain it off the top of my head the way that works, because it's a little bit complicated. But instead of voting just for one, if there are multiple candidates, say at least 3, you can vote for any of them that you would be willing to take. And you can rank them 1, 2, 3, or whatever. Let's imagine there's 7. I can rank 1 down to 7 if I want to. Or it probably doesn't make much sense. I just go 1 to 6, right? Because that makes a 7. So if the person I voted for first comes in last in the first round of counting, they drop that candidate out, and then they go down to my second vote. And that vote gets added to the count for anybody else that was left in the election. And they keep doing that, dropping the one that's got the least number of votes until somebody gets 51%.
Okay.
What this allows me to do is to vote for whom I really want, and know that even if that person is just a minor party candidate or doesn't have much chance, I've at least got a chance to say, this is who I really want.
Yeah.
And then if that person loses, I still get a chance to say, okay, that one loses, here's who I want second. And everybody gets the same chance. So what it means is there's for one thing, there's way better information given. Now I know, hey, 5% of the people really wanted this. What's going on here? That's a lot of people. Maybe I should see if I could do things to help that, and they'll vote for me next time. But it also means that it's not like you're less likely to just waste a vote. Some people are strategic. They vote. They might, but you're less incentive to be strategic. Right now, if you're looking at the two major candidates for president, maybe you don't like either one of them. Yeah, but you might hold your nose and vote for one to try to keep the other one that's even worse out. But the system looks just like you love that candidate.
Right.
They'd likely interpret, that all these people love me. If we had a system like the ranked choice voting, that person who wins would know, I only won because I was third and fourth choices of a lot of people. That means I probably ought to be careful in because I'll lose them if I don't. So I think it gives the system a better outcome, and it gives the candidates much more information that they can use to be smart in their choices and policies. So to me, it might be worth the complication.
I would tend to agree because my background is in engineering, and I think data is extremely important, like you mentioned. Now, I know we're kind of doing the same thing where, maybe we're rah-rah behind something and saying, oh, this is great. But I'm sure there's points against it.
Well, I've already mentioned it is complicated.
Well, I guess there's complication.
Let me say more about that.
Okay.
Because I said earlier that when you vote, you are kind of reinforcing your tie to the system. If you vote over and over again and always lose, that's hard.
Yeah.
And in this case, if the voting is so complicated that you don't feel like you can do it right, that's not going to help with the legitimacy of the vote. So that's the main argument, as I understand it, against it, is that if it gets so complicated that people just give up, or they feel like they didn't understand what they were doing, then that undermines its value.
Gotcha. Okay. So, yeah, and then maybe just because I struggle to see how it would be too complicated to understand, I guess I have to recognize anyone who's 18 can vote, and there are wide ranges of, understanding numbers and things like that. So it may not be as obvious as it seems.
Not just the 18-year-olds. It's people who have been doing it for 50 years.
Okay.
And it's hard to get your mind around the different. I haven't been doing 50 years. Actually, I will have done this year. That's 50 years ago that I had my first vote. So now you know how old I am. I think if you've ever sat down at family and you play a table game and somebody says, "Oh, these rules are just too complicated," and you go, "What are you talking about?" Well, they really are too complicated for them at that point. They're not in mind to get it. They just didn't get on it. Something wasn't bearing. You don't want that to happen in the election.
Yeah,
it's worse than if somebody says, "I don't think I'll play because it's too complicated."
Okay, no, that's good insight, because I tend to be that kind of person who said, "You're just why it's not that hard," and so maybe I'm the same person for this, is saying it's not that hard, just figure it out.
Well, if we were to adopt it, I'm pretty confident that within a generation, which might be too long, within a generation, everybody would have figured it out. We do a lot of things in life that are more complicated than ranked choice voting. But to say all of a sudden, for a lot of people, it would be all of a sudden, oh, what is this? Right now, with so many people deliberately sowing distrust in our elections, it's a little bit of an extra risk, because it would be easy for somebody to say, "Aha, we lost. It was a conspiracy by X and Y to make us lose."
Okay.
And that's another issue.
And I guess I think you'd mentioned earlier, it's for people who are very strong on their party line, it could undermine that as well. If you have, for example, you have the Republican, just use three parties: Republican, Democrat, the main two. Then you have independent. So someone's running as an independent. Yeah. Maybe they'll get 5% of the votes, and then there's whatever the other ones are split up, to have the majority. But it would be interesting data to see, well, what if actually 2/3 of the people want it? It wouldn't be 2/3. Maybe a third of the people, a third of the people would have said, "Hey, I don't like either candidate. I really like this person." And now it would allow more choice. Because I tend to fall in the category of, I'm not a huge fan of either candidate, and it's hard for me to overlook certain things on either side that I kind of wonder, like, how is that not an issue for you at all? But being able to say, hey, if I don't want this side to win, I can do that. I can say who I really want. And
yes. And then you can get it. If everybody were comfortable doing that and knew how to do it and do it well, we would really know how much room there is for a different party, or how many people are just barely voting for either a Democrat or Republican. Even if we just ended up with two parties, it would tend to pull them back towards the center.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see. And I think it was the flip side, by the way.
That's
that
it.
Website.
That's it. Good for you.
The flip side. So that would be an interesting one to look at, ranked choice voting. Now, is this just Oregon? Is this nationally being...
So the first state that has, I think Maine is the one that's had it most widespread. In Alaska, they've been using it in some elections.
Okay.
I didn't review the list before this because I didn't know it was coming up. But Portland has just adopted it, and they're running their first election for city council, city commission, I think they call it, in Portland. They've just carved it up into different districts, and they have, I think, 3 candidates, 3 seats in this district or something like that. So they're going to try it. And the proposal is that we do it for all the state elections, as I understand it. The presidential election is difficult because of the Electoral College, which really does put a lot of pressure to have just 2 parties. Because if you get 3-way splits, you get all kinds of trouble with stuff in the House of Representatives and all this. It gets messy.
Interesting. Maybe there needs to be a little bit of a mess and cleanup, but that's just my thought. Yeah, it is hard to not get political. I try, but hopefully this doesn't feel too one-sided for anyone listening. I'll actually go back and see. I think we had already talked about some of the other groups, and even the conversation groups. Now, is that directly connected to United as Neighbors, or is that separate?
Well, it's first of all, United as Neighbors is pretty informal. I mean, it's whoever shows up to the planning meetings, basically. So the United as Neighbors was where the community conversations idea came up, and the original organizers of it are connected to the United as Neighbors. That group that plans the community conversations per se is having a meeting later next week to get it started again this year.
And by next week, by the time this is published, it would be what date that might be? The week of
I think
last week of October.
Yeah, it's the last week of October. It's not really a public meeting, so.
Oh, okay.
Because it's just for people who are ready to help organize the community conversations. So that we should be hearing more about that. I'll be at that meeting and representing both Civility Project and among the ones representing United as Neighbors there. But it's kind of its own thing. United as Neighbors is really helping it, supporting it. When United as Neighbors had a booth at the Old Fashioned Festival, both for the last 2 years, and we featured community conversations at that booth because it's really part of what we're supporting in United as Neighbors.
And that is where people can come and like you said, just being able to explain what the other side believes is a first step. This
is a chance for us to listen to each other across differences in politics. So they have different topics of public interest, and people just share. They share what they think, and they listen to each other. So it's not a debate; it's a listening session.
Yeah, which I think will be important as we continue to move forward. Yes. Well, Ron, thank you. And are there any last remarks you'd like to?
Well, I would thank you for doing this. I think that that your podcast has, in my view, a pro-civility effect because you're introducing us to each other in the community, and you've been wide-ranging in your interests, and that's been great. And I hope people listening to this who might be across the political spectrum themselves can be encouraged to get outside their bubble, and I call that debubbling themselves. Get outside their bubble and renew or make friendships with people who disagree with themselves, and not think of the disagreement itself as the issue, because it's part of what God gave us. It's on purpose that we disagree. And the question is how we manage that resource. And I would like us to manage it better.
Last question. What gives you hope for the future of Newberg? And I guess specifically when it comes to civility around politics.
Well, so many people in the Newberg and Dundee area, I'm going to continue to use Dundee since I live there, they just really love being in this area. And
I include Dundee and Newberg, I should probably say that, but I see it as one. I know they're separate. The
Newberg people sometimes forget. Anyway, so we all love living here. That's not correlated to our politics. People from the left and right just enjoy living here and appreciating the things we have in our community that are good and that you help highlight. That's tremendous. And since that's the case, I think we have a resource that might not be shared in other places, and sharing our commitment to having a good community where everybody can thrive. And I think that's shared by everybody. And that gives us something to work with to start with. And I've seen, I've certainly seen amongst individuals, some important individuals, who some of them are involved in local public office, who have, from what I can tell, really developed an appreciation for opposite points of view that they may not have had before, and have gone out of their way to encounter those. And I think that's very helpful.
Well, I want to say thank you, because the work you're doing with the Civility Project, I think it is having an impact. And I think small shifts can make a difference in culture. And I think most people would admit, yeah, it'd be nice to see more civility. Like if asked, like, is more civility better or less civility better? Most people are going to say more. Yeah. And I think having someone who can do that and kind of share what that can look like, and honestly give people hope that, hey, this is possible. We're not just stuck and doomed to all hate each other. I think that's important. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. I wouldn't have a podcast to do if it weren't for people like you making real differences. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Givingtown podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think might benefit from hearing it. While more and more people are continuing to hear about this podcast, I still need your help to spread the message about all the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next episode.